Hi guys, Miss Eglin here. Today I wanted to review the last 5 chapters of The Giver, and I know a lot of you had emailed me about the ending, so I will talk very briefly about that. In chapter 18, we have Jonas coming into the Giver's annex room, and he says to him, Giver, do you ever think about release? And so they kind of get into it. And then the Giver tells the story of the previous receiver of memory. And we find out that this woman, the Giver says, was remarkable, very self-possessed and serene. She was very calm. She was intelligent, eager to learn, just like Jonas. And we find out, and the Giver hesitated painfully, as if saying the name aloud might be excruciating, like it might be very painful for him. We find out her name was Rosemary. And remember, that's the name that cannot be spoken by other members of the community. So the Giver saying, like, I feel for you, Jonas, I loved her. So then the Giver starts talking about, I gave her emotional pain. And remember, this is the Giver's job. He has to give her the memories. But he said he didn't give her war, but he gave her emotionally painful memories. So she didn't have the physical memories like the broken leg, but the Giver says, I gave her loneliness. I gave her loss. I transferred a memory of a child taken from her parents. So she was very stunned. So then Rosemary starts being really affected like that, so the Giver backs off and gives her happier memories. But then he says, by that time it was too late. The times of laughter were gone. She stood up very silently, frowning as if she were making a decision. Then she came over, put her arms around me. She kissed my cheek. So the Giver's recalling this. So then we find out she leaves the room. She went directly and applied for release. So Jonas is really surprised, and he said, she's not allowed to do that. It's in the rules. And then the Giver says, it's in your rules, Jonas, but it wasn't in hers. So, we get the impression that they put that in Jonas's rules because of what Rosemary did. And then Jonas starts kind of thinking about what happened if I fell in the river, like the little 4 Caleb. What would happen to the memories? And then we find out that the community gets the memories. It says the memories came back to the people. So Rosemary applies for release. She's gone. The memories go back to the people, and that was only 5 weeks worth. And then the Giver's thinking, if they lost you with all the training you've had, the people would have to deal with those memories again. And then Jonas starts thinking, the only way I deal with this is by having you there to help me. And then they sort of start thinking like, well, if Jonas leaves the community, then the Giver would have to help the people again. But he still tells him, I know you're a good swimmer, Jonas, but stay away from the river. And then it says, the Giver's thoughts seemed to be elsewhere. His eyes were very troubled. So then we go into chapter 19, and then Jonas starts talking about how Father has released the new child. And then we kind of get in this kind of awkward exchange of, the Giver says to Jonas, do you want to watch the release? They're all recorded. And Jonas doesn't really want to because he's thinking, his father wouldn't like it. And then the Giver says, I think you should. And Jonas is like, okay. So Jonas starts talking through this, and the Giver's like, Jonas, just listen, watch what's happening. So the father comes in with another nurturer assistant in training, and they have these identical newborns. They're both males, and they weigh them, and the bigger one goes to the assistant, and he says, now the father says, now clean them up and make them comfy. And then he takes the smaller one, and he takes a syringe and inserts it into the newborn's forehead. Okay, so Jonas is like, what's going on? And the Giver's like, shh, watch this. So sadly, Jonas finally realizes, as the father's like, that wasn't that bad. And he's talking, in that kind of baby voice, um, that this twin is now dead. So he says he killed it. My father killed it, Jonas said to himself, stunned at what he was realizing. So then his father, and this is disturbing, cleans up the room, takes a box, sets it on the bed, puts the new child in it, and then throws it away. And he says it seemed to be the same sort of chute in which trash was deposited at school. So he basically throws this baby in the garbage with a shove and goes, "Bye bye, little guy." And the screen goes blank. So now Jonas knows what release is. Okay? It is death. So then the giver turned to him and quite calmly he says, Rosemary, when she basically applied for release, she wanted to inject herself. And he goes into this, you suggest to Jonas that perhaps she wasn't brave enough. I don't know about bravery, what it is, what it means. I do know that I sat there, here, numb with horror, wretched, just miserable with helplessness, and I listened as Rosemary told them she would prefer to inject herself. And then she did, so I didn't watch, I looked away. Well, there you are, Jonas. You were wondering about release, he said in a bitter voice. So at this point, Jonas just feels a ripping sensation, terrible pain, and he just yells out. And that is the end of 19. So in chapter 20, Jonas is now freaking out. He doesn't want to go home, and the giver's like, you need to calm down. You can stay here the night, and we'll talk, because you really can't go home in this state. So then the giver's trying to talk him down, like, okay, I don't lie to you, but everybody else is empowered to lie. Like, basically, your father was told he has to lie for his job. And then Jonas realizes release is always like that for people who break the rules 3 times for the old. Do they kill the old? Yes, it's true. What about Fiona? Well, Fiona, working in the house of the old, is also learning how to release or kill people. So they are talking, and then they start making up this plan. And they say, memories need to be shared. And then Jonas says, I've shared them with you. And he says, that's true. But like the giver's like, I know something needs to change. Like, we can't go on like this. Like, we're the only ones living, and Jonas and the giver talk about some kind of plan. And he says, if their plan failed, he would likely be killed. But what did it matter if he stayed? His life was no longer worth living. So Jonas is realizing, this community kills people. There's no feelings, that nobody can really care about anybody else. And then the giver saying, I can't leave the community, because if you leave, so we get the idea that they're making a plan for Jonas to leave so the community would get the memories. Then the giver wants to stay and help the people because they can't handle the emotion. And then Jonas tries to convince the giver to come with him. Like, forget about these people. You don't need to care about them. Just come with me. And the giver looked at him with a questioning smile. Jonas hung his head. Of course they needed to care. It was the meaning of everything. So he knows the giver cannot leave the community. And then the giver's getting weaker. He doesn't see color, but we find out when he was like Jonas's age, he was hearing beyond. And Jonas said, what did you hear? And then the giver says, music. I began to hear something truly remarkable. It's called music. I'll give you some before I go. And then he says, no, giver, I want you to keep that. So now we're realizing not only does the community not have color, emotion, and things like that, they don't have music. Okay, so again, that's another thing they don't have. So Jonas goes home the next day and basically, has to act normally. And then, they're talking about this plan, this escape. And so basically the next ceremony day, Jonas is going to slip away during the ceremony and the giver's going to help him, and like they're going to take a car to another community, and so Jonas is going to get as far as possible, which they're not allowed to do. But basically he's going to disappear, and then they basically are going to kind of fake his own death, even though he'll be alive. And then I think they're going to leave his bike and his clothes by the river and basically say, oh, Jonas must have drowned, like the, little Fort Caleb. And then the giver will kind of get the community back on track with Jonas faking his own death. Okay, so that's the plan. And then again, Jonas tries to get the giver to come with him, and he says, but don't you want to be with me, giver? Jonas asked sadly, and the giver hugged him. I love you, Jonas, but I have another place to go. When my work here is finished, I want to be with my daughter. And then Jonas is like, I didn't know you had a daughter. I knew you had a spouse. I didn't know you had a daughter. And then the giver says her name was Rosemary. So at the end of 20, we find out Rosemary was not only the receiver in training who got released, she was the giver's daughter. So that makes a lot of sense there. So then he's devastated. Okay, so 21, so they're talking about the plan, and it would have worked, so they had a pretty good plan. And then in 21, Jonas is with his family, and then father says to Gabe, enjoy it, little guy. This is your last night as visitor. And basically Jonas is like, what are you talking about? Well, it turns out the night that Jonas spent with the giver, they tried to let Gabe sleep alone, and he couldn't sleep. Okay, so then the father goes to the committee and was like, this kid is not cutting it. And he goes, even I voted for Gabe to be released. So Jonas realizes they're going to release Gabe the next day. So he says he left that night. He took his father's bicycle. He took stolen food, even though it was on the porch. It was like leftovers, and he had taken Gabriel. So Jonas puts Gabe in the back and takes off, trying to go as far as he could, but he's not prepared. He doesn't have enough food. He didn't mean to bring Gabe, but if he didn't, Gabe would have been killed in the morning. So they just bike off as far as they could go, and then during the day they have to hide from the searchers. So together the fugitives slept through the first dangerous day. So now there's planes overhead, and Jonas is just going as far as he can. He did not get the memories from the giver for courage. Their search planes, he knew they can see color, like from heat. So he gives cold memories to like cool down their body temperatures, so the planes can't see them. And again, they're hiding, and they're terrified these planes are going to catch them because Jonas has mentioned, they would get killed. And then Jonas says, finally, there was an entire day and night where they did not come at all. So they're getting far enough where the plane search is basically over. So now in 22, they're getting further and further. Jonas wrecks the bike, twists his ankle. There's trees. They start seeing things they've never seen before, like animals. And there's streams, and this is kind of disgusting, but they're starting to not have enough food, and they're starving. So finally, Jonas catches these fish and hacks them to pieces raw, and they ate, some berries, and they even tried to catch a bird without success for food. So again, now they're hungry all the time. And then Jonas remembers when he was reprimanded for saying, I'm starving. And they said, you'll never be starving. Nobody is starving. It doesn't happen. And he's like, well, if I would have stayed in the community, I wouldn't have starved. But then he says, I would have starved in other ways because there was no emotion, there was no color, there was no music. So he wouldn't have really been living. So things are getting really bad. And now Jonas is crying because he's afraid they're going to die. So finally we come to chapter 23, the last chapter, and they're in really bad shape, but Jonas is starting to feel like Elsewhere's not far away. And then, now things are getting cold. They're not dressed properly. And now it's snowing. So Jonas is trying to get warm memories because they're not only freezing, they're starving. And he's just trying to go on as far as he can because Jonas knows if he collapses, not only will he die, Gabriel will die. So they're trying to get to the top of the hill, and then he's remembering happiness. And then something really odd happens where Jonas says, I remember this place, Gabe, and it was true. And they're trying to get to the top of this hill. And then Jonas finds a sled at the top of the hill, finds a rope, gets on the sled, and they started down. Jonas is in such bad shape, he's passing out. And he said he was aware with certainty and joy below ahead that they were waiting for him and that they were waiting too for the baby. Now it's the first time they say baby instead of new child. For the first time he heard something he knew to be music. He heard people singing. Behind him, across vast distances of space and time, from the place he had left, he thought he heard music too, but perhaps it was only an echo. Okay, so that is the end. I'm going to talk about the ending in another video. So did they make it? Did they not? Well, let's talk about it in the next video. Thanks for listening.